Sounded a little echoey. Good morning, everyone. We're continuing in our series looking at some of the parables of Jesus, as well as how Jesus fills our thirst for a variety of aspects in our spiritual needs. And today's sermon, we're looking at our thirst for acceptance, our innate, indrawn, central need to be accepted, and how Jesus fills that need as well. Luke 16, 1 through 15 is where we're going to go. Got a couple questions to begin with. How is your appetite? Everybody smell coffee? Alan did. He came over to check, make sure it was ready, or that I wasn't tricking him, that it wasn't something else in the coffee pot. How long would it take you to think of how nice it would be to have a cold drink of, or a nice warm cup of? How long does it take for us to stimulate our appetite? Or a big plate of, or a nice, we're made that way. We're made to have an appetite. And so today I came in a little bit earlier and I made some coffee. There's coffee and tea, there's water bottles, there's some from the car rally, there's little bottles of Coke and even that P word that we don't talk about. Got to make sure they're out of the house, But I thought, well, after service, we have the time to think about it, to smell it, to be ready to have our appetite together. And in fellowship, we have an opportunity to share that. We're wired to have an appetite, and not only that, but we're wired to have an appetite that needs diversity. We don't just eat the same thing over and over. Some people can do it longer than others. I can live off leftovers a lot longer than Naomi can. But we're still built with an appetite, and we're made to crave different things. And I'm trying to show that in the series is that we have a thirst, which is a part of our appetite. The second question, think about our biological imperative to ingest water and other liquids. Do you like that? What is our biological imperative to ingest our liquids? You know that it's hardwired into your brain. It's triggered by your organs. It's also triggered by your brain. What is that hardwired desire? Thirst. It's hardwired. We are hardwired to have a thirst. Very few people don't have that trigger, but their organs do. Your body will tell you when you're getting dehydrated. Your body will tell you when you need more liquid. It's a part of our appetite. It's where we are. We have other physical, social, mental, and spiritual needs. Today we're going to be looking at a parable that's called the hardest parable of Jesus, as well as a little verse from Psalm 20. I was going to do the whole thing, but kind of ran out of space to do that. I'd like to encourage you to read it, Psalm 20, to see that we're hardwired to need acceptance from God and also hardwired to want acceptance from others. But that's where it can get tricky, because our need for acceptance can actually lead us away from God. Instead of wanting to be accepted by God, we can say, I would rather be accepted by people. And that can lead us away. It's intended to lead us towards Him, but that appetite can go astray and lead us in the wrong direction. In the end, it's God's acceptance that should direct our lives. Last week we talked about living a lifestyle, living an on-purpose life that's directed by one verse. Matthew 25:21. Living a life that says the purpose of my life is to hear from Jesus, well done, good and faithful servant. That should direct all of our choices, should direct everything that we do, so that everything is leading towards, is this pleasing to God? And when we keep that in mind, that helps us. Do you see, that's where we also know that we're accepted by God. We're accepted because of mercy. That's why we started with that. But God also wants us to live a life that says, it's you above me. I want to please you even above pleasing myself. He has invested his talents in the church and in the kingdom, and he would like a return on investment. That's why he's given us one another. Our thirst for God is God-given. Do you see my little picture here? Sometimes we want to be filled and we're thirsty, but we get things in the wrong order. You're going to be thirsty all day you do that. Just grab the water bottle the wrong way and that don't taste right. We're wired to be thirsty. And there's lots of thirsty passages. There's about, I looked up about 74 passages in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, that use the word thirst or thirsty, that tied to physical thirst and God filling our spiritual thirst. Nehemiah 9:20, this one here, talks about physical, that God give us a physical desire. The prophet reminds the people that God is their provider for both the spiritual and the physical. He said, you gave your good spirit to instruct them. You did not withhold your manna from their mouths and gave them water for their thirst. But he starts with the spiritual. You gave your spirit to instruct them in the same way that you gave them manna and water for their physical. In the Psalms, Dick was alluding to the Psalms as part of our songs and how they were, central to what we sing. In Psalm 42:2, my soul thirsts for God, for the living God. Where can I go and meet with God? My soul thirsts for God. We have a natural connection to what it's like to thirst physically, and in the psalmist says, but my soul does the same thing. In 63:1, O God, you are my God, earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My body longs for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Naomi, you singing that in your head? It's a canticle. You are my God, earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. Does it? Same way that your body thirsts for water, does your soul crave after God in the same way? If we had our new projector, which didn't come in this week, you could read this. Whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. John 4:14. It's a reminder that God is providing for us the whole time. In Psalm 146, I spread out my hands to you, my soul thirsts for you like a parched land. You know what it's like when you water the lawn right now? Especially those of us that live on clay. All those clay cracks start to come together. You could just keep dumping water on it. It'll take it. But so do we. When God wants to bless us, we're like a parched land. We want to receive that. We crave to be connected to God in the same way. And as a bonus one, let's see if you can remember this one. Matthew chapter 5, verse 6. What do you need to be hungering and thirsting for? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. That's not self-righteousness. That is to be right with God. Blessed are those that in their base character, that every day there is that desire to be right with God. That's how we live the Matthew 25:21, is that it is an appetite that is always on the edge. There's always more. Even when you're filled, you think about the next one. There's always that bit more that you are wanting from God and to give back to God. Checking your appetite. Do you have a physical appetite? Do you respond to that physical appetite? Most of us had a drink this morning or some breakfast. Yeah, we respond to that. But how attuned are you to this side of your appetite? This desire to be close to God, this desire to be with God's people, this desire to be here this morning in worship. That it's not just a maybe, it is a desire. It is a hunger and a thirst to be with the church, to worship together, to be with God. That you were looking forward to it like you were looking forward to a good meal. You just know that that's going to be filling, that it's going to help you all week. How aware of you of your appetite for God? What do you do to satisfy this appetite? Because it's as indwelled within us. It is as a part of us as our physical. And so it's spiritual conversation. It's studying together. It's in worship. It's in spiritual conversations with a variety of people. But it is within us to have that appetite taken care of. And when we don't have that, like Jean, who was taken away from us for a week, you miss it, don't you? She called Mom every day. Because you miss that connection. How might an increase in this appetite help you become even healthier spiritually? You see how we're thinking about this? If our desire to be with God, our desire to be a part of the kingdom, our desire to be at work in the kingdom, how is that going to keep you healthy instead of the junk food? Or just not eating? How do you make that a constant part of your connection? We're going to look at a couple of passages. I'm proposing today that we have a built-in desire to be accepted by God, and that it is God who has placed that desire within us. Many people, all of us, really try to satisfy this desire by seeking acceptance from others, because we like to be liked. But sometimes that liking to be liked can lead us away. The idea that I want to fit in, I don't like to stand out. But it can take us the wrong way. And when we stop at that, we should realize that our true hunger is deeper. That really we will have that sense of satisfaction because we know that we're accepted and loved by God. And that other relationships are way more fickle than that. They're based on conditional acceptance. Whereas God has blessed us with His grace and His mercy, and He accepts us, and He loves us, and He wants us to crave Him like He craves to be with us. But too often in our society, we have a gain versus cost mentality. I don't mind being with people as long as they don't cost me more than I benefit. And we see that when they get sick, when they get tired, when there's financial struggles, when you've got to do more caring for than being receiving, we see that care kind of slip because they're costing more than I'm gaining. And then we can think it's unfair that people would do the same for us. We have that idea. We cut people out of our lives. We kind of give them more of an arm distance when you're not gaining the same thing, but then we can get frustrated when people do that to us. That's the fickle side of things. But God loves us and accepts us. The passage we're going to look at, like I said, is referred to. There are a number of commentaries that call it the hardest of the parables. It's the most difficult because in Luke 16, 1 through 15, the main confusion about the parable is that Jesus seems to be commending a manager for illegal activity. And we think, well, that doesn't seem right. So let's take a look. What really is going on in this passage? Jesus told His disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So He called him and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." Now the parable just before this is the parable of the prodigal son. And what did he do with his father's resources? The word there is squandered. So He tells him another parable. Here's a manager that was supposed to be managing the resources of the master, but he didn't manage them. He wasted his possessions and he used them on himself. This manager had access to the master's wealth and he used it for himself. But now he has to give an account. And he knows his own limits. At this point, in verse 2, you cannot be manager any longer. He just heard the words, you're fired. It's not even complete the end of your shift. Here's your 2 weeks notice. You're fired. And this manager looks at his life and he looks at his talents, he looks at his abilities, and he says, I don't like that. I'm in real trouble here. The manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. And then here's some self-awareness. I am not strong enough to dig. I'm too ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do. So that when I lose my job here, what's his purpose? When I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. See what he's doing? I know when I get fired and I can't go back to that home, I know what I can do so that I'll be accepted. Are you with me on this? Not much of a hole digger, too proud to beg yet, probably will if I have to, but he's telling this parable of this manager who's found out his limits. He knows that his job is lost. He takes a quick inventory of what he can do to get out of this. You know what he does have? He still has the account ledger. He can use that to take care of himself. A key to the parable is here in verse 4. He knows that he's going to lose his job and his master's acceptance, so he does what he can to gain the acceptance of the tenants. How can I make sure that other people will accept me if I lose it with the master? Then comes the part that's, comes across as unethical. Verse 5. So he called in each of his master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. He just had a 50% increase or decrease in his debt. Then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, take your bill, make it 800. He didn't quite get the 50%, but he's down from 1,000 to 800. He's got to go turn in the books back to the master. So how do you think the master's going to respond to this? Wait a second, somebody scribbled that out. There seems to be some eraser marks here. That doesn't seem quite right. What's going on? But in verse 8, this is why the parable seems to be very difficult. The master commended the dishonest manager. Why? Because he acted shrewdly. And then he explains. See, Jesus is talking. Jesus is providing this as a story, an illustration, a life lesson. He gets basically to the moral of the story when he says, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. Worldly minded people know how to be accepted by worldly people. True? Worldly minded people know how to be accepted by other worldly minded people. And they will do whatever it takes to be accepted. People of the light may lose this desire to be accepted, and therefore lose their ability to be an influence. Because we don't necessarily care if people accept us, we may lose the ability to be an influence. But people of the world won't lose that. In verse 9, this is what he tells him to do. I tell you, this is to everybody that's gathered there, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. You see why that seems to be a confusing parable? What did he just tell him to do? Take your wealth and buy friends. Make sure that you're accepted by people. Use your wealth while you have it, because when it's gone, You need to be ready for eternity. Be shrewd enough to use the temporary for eternal, and wealth is temporary. The manager was commended for being shrewd. He was called dishonest, but he was commended for being shrewd. So this is how I understand it. He's told by the master what was required of him. Each of these people, so Ella owns the land, right? Is it Eric or Debbie? Who's the manager? So Debbie. Is it right, we lease the garden off of you. And the expectation is 10 zucchini, 400 carrots. And so that's what we have to turn in. That's what Ella's expecting. But we give it to Debbie, and she tells us what she expects because she doesn't want to plant a garden. So why don't I say 800 carrots, I'll keep some. You see how the plan works? This is how management, it's a feudal system. The master says everybody owes me something, but the manager makes his money by getting the extra. And so he comes with the ledger and he says, the master is in the first account, he's expecting the 500, right? 800 gallons of olive oil. What the master's expecting is 400. So he says, I'm taking my cut off. I'm not getting paid anything for this. You just pay the master and I'll take nothing. And the second one, the same way. He's expecting 800. You give him the 800 and I'm out of it. I'm not taking anything on this job. But when I do, remember that I gave you that cut. See what's happening? That's the story. He knows in order to not be in trouble with the master, I'll take nothing here. I'll gain nothing here to be ready for the future. You see how this is a parable about the kingdom? If I'm only accepted by men or God, who are you going to make sure you're accepted by? All God. You're going to make sure that you don't mess that account up. Even though it means you may not gain anything here. You're going to make sure that you have that right. He removes his extra. He exchanged financial profit and financial security and temporary safety for long-term benefits. And he's commended for being shrewd enough to think of the long term, not just the short term. The choice between acceptance or wealth is the focus of the rest of the section. Whoever can be trusted with very little can be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will be dishonest with much. So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? And then comes a section that we're more familiar with, but we may not think that it fits into this context. No servant can serve two masters. Do you realize that's you? And everybody else that you know? And everybody that's coming before you and after you? No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one or love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve what? Both God and money. But the problem is the money is a poor translation of what's going on here. It is capitalized to show us something, but it's a Semitic term for the treasure a person trusts in. Do you like that definition? You cannot serve both God and other treasure that you trust in. Anything else that you would trust in. You either trust in God or you trust in other things. You can't have it both ways. You can't put your eggs in two baskets. This is either all God or other things. But you can't walk the line. It's one or the other. And who is he speaking to? Verse 14, the Pharisees. Now we get into the money. There's an interesting term here that I put up. The Pharisees, and then how does he define them, describe them? Who loved money. And he uses a compound Greek word. The first part is love, philo, like Philadelphia, love of, and agoros is silver. So he's made a compound word. He's saying the Pharisees, the silver lovers. There's no hiding the point of this statement. It is very pointed. Not who liked money or who used money, but the silver lovers. Heard all this and they were sneering at Jesus. People don't like to be called silver lovers, especially when they're supposed to be religious. So he said to them, verse 15, he said to them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your hearts. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. This parable is about being accepted and realizing that it comes down to two paths. You can either be accepted by people or you can be accepted by God. But the value of being accepted by God is he tells you, now go and use your blessings to be accepted by people. See that? Whereas if you choose to be accepted by people, you lose the acceptance of God. But God says, use your wealth for eternal purpose. So what's the application? I got 7 things I want us to think of. We need to consider if our desire to be accepted by God outweighs our desire to be accepted by people. We need to really realize what path we're going down. Because it is God first. It is really God only. In the case of if it's man or God, the choice is God every time. We need to consider how we're using God's wealth and blessings to make relationships and introduce people to Jesus to prepare them for eternity. This is part of a spiritually focused life that has room for investing in people with a spiritual focus. Kind of goes back to the parable of the talents. If God has blessed me with a car, how do I use my car for the kingdom? If he's blessed me with a house, how do I use my house for the kingdom? If I have a bank account, how is that for the kingdom? How is a physical connected to the kingdom? Everything has a connection. Anything that God has blessed us with, he expects us to be investing that in the kingdom. We would do well to evaluate if our trust is more rooted in what we can do with our resources, like it is when we trust in our mammon, or in the spiritual treasure that God blesses us with. I put the U.S. currency. What's it say on there? Which God are they trusting? You know, isn't that a bit of a paradox to put it on your currency? Do we really, even in our finances, trust God? Or do we start to trust our finances? How about this? Would you be more concerned if you went home and found that your car was gone, your house was gone? Would you be more concerned about the loss of your job, your house, your car, or the loss of your faith? The loss of this congregation, the loss of somebody else's faith? What would bother you more? That's about kingdom thinking. We must be ready for the decisions that place us at the crossroad between faith and finances, for one. That's what he's talking about. There's a crossroads where we're making a decision and we say, I can either trust in God or I can finances. You have to choose between making money or serving God and worshiping together. You take a job, you say, I don't work Sundays. Even if that means you don't take a job. Unless you're a preacher, but then you got to. Or else this whole thing wouldn't work well. But it's about making money or serving God. We make those decisions between serving Jesus in the church or meeting my desires and the needs of my family or friends or fulfillment. This is making Sunday worship a priority. How about this? Making Sunday worship a priority or taking on anything that competes with that time frame. Anything. If it says I can't be at service, and you're at the crossroads of making a decision, do we do this? Do I do this? But I can't be at services? Then choose wisely. Because that road leads somewhere. As we looked at last week, we need to be ready to give an account for how we've used his investment in us to serve him, the church and the kingdom. Everything that he's blessed us with, we're going to give an account. We need to celebrate the blessings that God has given us and the people that He's placed in our lives and in the church and outside the church. Celebrate that God has given us relationships, that we can be accepted by one another, that we can have friendships that are outside the church, but that they don't direct us away from God. And the last thing, this week, as we grow our appetite for Jesus, let's encourage one another with the words of request from Psalm 20, verse 4. Let's think about the blessing of being able to be together, to be a part of one another's lives, and pray this part of a prayer. It's a psalm, this desire over one another. May He give you the desire of your heart and make all your plans succeed. It's not a good... Because when our desire is to be accepted by God, may He give you the desire of your heart and make all your plans succeed. Because when we do that, God receives the glory. He receives the blessing. He knows that our thirst for acceptance is really filled in Him, even though it can be uncomfortable to be not accepted by others, and to make the changes that say God first. But when we do so, we're much more content.